In the quiet town of Millbrook, mornings rarely arrived with drama. They came gently, like a slow breath drifting through the streets, touching every house in nearly the same way it had the day before. The sun rose gradually behind a line of tall maple trees that bordered the eastern edge of town. Its light slipped across rooftops and chimneys before spilling into empty streets. The air held that early morning stillness that existed only for a short while each day, before cars started, before shop doors opened, before the small noises of ordinary life filled the town again. For the people of Millbrook, this was simply how mornings worked. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the lights inside the small brick house on Hawthorne Street flickered on. Inside the kitchen, Martha Ellis was already standing beside the stove. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had performed the same routine for decades. The coffee maker hummed quietly as steam rose from the pot. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen and into the narrow hallway that led toward the bedrooms. Martha poured the first cup and set it beside the window. From there, she could see most of Hawthorne Street, the neat row of houses, the old oak tree in the middle of the sidewalk, and the mailbox where the morning newspaper would arrive any minute now. She took a small sip and watched the sky brighten. Across the street, a porch light clicked off. Next door, someone opened a window. Millbrook was waking up. None of it felt remarkable. Nothing about this particular morning seemed different from the thousands that had come before it. But history, as it often does, had a strange habit of hiding inside ordinary moments. At 5:45 a.m., the familiar rumble of a small truck rolled down Maple Avenue. It belonged to Tom Alvarez, the town's newspaper delivery driver. The truck moved slowly, its tires crunching softly over the gravel edges of the road. Tom had been delivering newspapers in Millbrook for nearly 15 years. He knew every driveway, every porch, every mailbox. Without thinking, his arm moved in a steady rhythm. Grab a newspaper, roll it, toss it toward the porch. Thump. Another newspaper landed neatly against a front door. Thump. Another one slid across a wooden porch floor. Tom didn't read most of the headlines. He rarely had time. His job was simply to deliver them. Yet the papers stacked beside him that morning carried stories from far beyond Millbrook. Stories about political debates in Washington, technological breakthroughs in California, and quiet economic shifts that were slowly changing towns just like this one all across America. The people of Millbrook would read those stories later over breakfast. For now, they were still waking up. By 6 o'clock, the town diner had already turned on its lights. The Millbrook Diner sat at the corner of Main Street and Jefferson Avenue. It was the kind of place that had looked almost exactly the same for 30 years. Red vinyl booths lined the walls. A long counter stretched across the room with a row of spinning stools. Behind the counter stood Joe Carter, the diner's owner, cook, and unofficial morning host. Joe was a tall man with gray hair and a permanent expression of quiet patience. He wore the same white apron every morning and had been opening the diner before sunrise since the early 1970s. He poured pancake batter onto the hot griddle and listened to the soft sizzle. Outside the window, the sky was now turning pale blue. The first customer walked through the door at 6:05 a.m. It was Harold Whitman. Harold was 76 years old and had lived in Millbrook longer than almost anyone else still around. His back was slightly bent now, and he walked with a careful step, but his mind remained sharp. "Morning, Joe," Harold said as he took his usual seat at the counter. "Morning," Joe replied. "Coffee?" Harold nodded. Joe placed a mug in front of him and filled it without asking anything else. Some habits in Millbrook required no explanation. Harold opened his newspaper and adjusted his glasses. He began reading the front page slowly, taking his time with each headline.
Outside, Main Street remained mostly empty. A delivery van passed by. A few birds hopped along the sidewalk. The town was still stretching awake. Farther down the road, the small Millbrook Elementary School sat quietly behind a chain-link fence. The playground swings moved slightly in the breeze. In a few hours, children would fill the yard with noise and laughter. But for now, the building stood silent. In the nearby neighborhood, Daniel Turner stepped out of his house carrying a worn leather briefcase. Daniel was 34 years old and worked at the manufacturing plant just outside town. The plant had once been the economic heart of Millbrook. For decades, it produced machine parts that were shipped all across the country. Nearly every family in town had someone who worked there. Daniel locked his car and looked briefly down the street. His neighbor, Mrs. Langford, was watering flowers near her porch. A boy rode his bicycle slowly along the sidewalk. Everything appeared normal. Daniel started his engine and drove toward the highway that led to the factory. He had no reason to think this morning would be remembered differently from any other. Across town, the post office opened its doors. Inside, Linda Watkins sorted letters into small wooden boxes behind the counter. She moved quickly, stacking envelopes and packages with practiced efficiency. Most of the mail contained ordinary things: bills, advertisements, postcards from relatives, small pieces of everyday life, traveling from one place to another. Linda had worked at the Millbrook Post Office for 11 years. She often joked that if you wanted to understand a town, you should watch its mail. Birth announcements, college acceptance letters, holiday cards, sometimes bad news too. Every envelope carried a small story. By 7 o'clock, the streets of Millbrook had begun to fill with movement. Cars pulled out of driveways, children waited at bus stops, shop owners unlocked their doors along Main Street. The barber shop opened first, then the hardware store, then the bakery where the smell of fresh bread drifted onto the sidewalk. People greeted each other the same way they always did. "Morning. How's it going? Gold one today." Simple conversations passed between neighbors who knew each other for years. Yet beneath these familiar routines, the country beyond Millbrook was slowly changing. Factories in larger cities were beginning to close, new technologies were emerging that would soon reshape industries, economic forces were shifting quietly beneath the surface of American life. Most people in Millbrook were only vaguely aware of these changes. Their focus remained on immediate things: work schedules, school assignments, grocery lists. Life moved forward one day at a time. At 7:30 a.m., the buses arrived. Children climbed aboard carrying backpacks nearly as big as they were. Parents waved from sidewalks. The buses pulled away, leaving small clouds of dust behind. Inside the Millbrook diner, the breakfast rush had begun. Joe flipped pancakes quickly as customers filled the booths. Conversations rose and blended together like overlapping radio stations. Someone talked about last night's baseball game. Another person complained about rising gas prices. Harold Whitman folded his newspaper and looked around the diner. He had watched this same scene unfold for decades. Different faces had come and gone over the years, but the rhythm remained familiar. Harold often thought about how towns like Millbrook carried history quietly, not through famous events or dramatic headlines, but through the steady repetition of ordinary days. He remembered when Main Street still had a movie theater. He remembered when the factory first opened. He remembered the day television arrived in town. Each moment had once seemed small, yet over time they formed the story of the place. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Shadows shortened. The town was now fully awake. A train horn sounded faintly in the distance as a freight train passed along the tracks several miles away. Most people barely noticed it, but the train carried goods that connected Millbrook to the wider world. Steel from Pennsylvania, electronics from California, and produce from farms hundreds of miles away. Even small towns were part of something larger. By mid-morning, the town shop owners greeted customers with familiar smiles. None of it felt unusual. Yet somewhere beyond the horizon of this quiet town, forces were already in motion. Economic shifts, technological changes, cultural transformations that would eventually reach even this peaceful place. Years later, people would look back and say that history had been unfolding all along. But on that particular morning, no one in Millbrook was thinking about history. They were thinking about coffee refills, about school assignments, about work deadlines, about the thousand small tasks that filled an ordinary day.
In the small town of Millbrook, there was one place that seemed to hold the entire rhythm of daily life together. It was not the school, or the town hall, or even the old factory on the edge of town. It was Main Street. Main Street was not particularly long, and it was certainly not famous. Travelers driving through Millbrook might pass it in less than 2 minutes without realizing they had just crossed the center of the town's quiet universe. But for the people who lived there, Main Street was where everything happened. If someone wanted to understand Millbrook, they only needed to spend a single morning walking slowly along that street. The day usually began at the corner where the Millbrook Diner stood. The diner had a large front window that reflected the morning sunlight and a small neon sign that had been glowing the same soft red color for nearly 30 years. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the air. Joe Carter stood behind the counter flipping pancakes with the same calm focus he had shown every morning since he bought the diner decades earlier. The regular customers were already seated at their usual places. Harold Whitman sat near the end of the counter with his newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee mug. 2 construction workers sat in the booth behind him, discussing the day's work schedule. A waitress named Carol moved between tables carrying plates of eggs and toast. In most cities, diners were simply places to eat, but in Millbrook, the diner was something more. It was where people exchanged news, shared opinions, and sometimes solved small problems before the day truly began. If someone's truck had broken down, someone at the diner would know a mechanic. If someone's son had been accepted to college, the news would travel from booth to booth within minutes. The conversations inside the diner were like the town's unofficial morning broadcast. Outside, the street slowly came to life. Next door to the diner stood the old barber shop. The wooden sign above the door read Frank's Barber Shop, though most people simply called it Frank's. Frank Delaney had been cutting hair on Main Street for almost 40 years. The shop itself had changed very little during that time. A red and white barber pole turned slowly outside the door, its motor humming quietly. Inside, the floor was covered with small pieces of freshly cut hair that swept easily into neat piles. 3 barber chairs faced a long mirror that stretched across the wall. Frank stood behind one of the chairs, sharpening his scissors when the bell above the door rang. "Morning, Frank," said the first customer of the day. Frank looked up and smiled. "Morning, Bill. Same as always?" Bill laughed. "If it's worked for 20 years, no reason to change it now." Frank nodded and draped the cloth around Bill's shoulders. As the scissors began their steady rhythm, the conversation quickly turned to familiar topics: local sports teams, weather predictions, and the latest rumor about a new store possibly opening on the far end of Main Street. In the barbershop, time seemed to move a little slower than everywhere else. People did not rush their haircuts. They stayed, talked, and listened. Sometimes someone who had already finished their haircut would remain sitting in one of the chairs along the wall just to hear the rest of the conversation. Main Street had a way of encouraging that kind of lingering. Farther down the block stood Miller's grocery store.
The grocery store had been owned by the Miller family for 2 generations. Its brick walls were slightly faded now, and the wooden door creaked softly each time it opened. Inside, the smell of fresh bread, apples, and the faint scent of coffee beans drifted through the air. Shelves were packed tightly with canned goods, cereal boxes, jars of peanut butter, and small handwritten price tags. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Eleanor Miller, who seemed to know almost every customer by name. When someone walked through the door, she rarely needed to ask what they were looking for. "Milk's in the cooler, Tom," she might say. "Your favorite bread just came in this morning, Mary." Sometimes customers came into the grocery store not because they needed groceries, but simply because they wanted to talk. Mrs. Miller understood this perfectly. Running a small-town grocery store required more than stocking shelves. It required patience, memory, and the ability to listen. The grocery store was where people discussed school events, town meetings, and occasionally shared quiet concerns about things happening in their lives. If someone in town was having a difficult week, chances were Mrs. Miller would hear about it first. Just across the street stood the Millbrook hardware store. The hardware store was owned by Robert Jenkins, a broad-shouldered man with a gray mustache and hands that always carried faint traces of sawdust or oil. His store was filled with tools hanging neatly along the walls: hammers, wrenches, nails, gardening equipment, and boxes filled with tiny screws organized by size. Robert had an unusual talent for fixing things. People often came into the store not knowing exactly what they needed. "My sink is leaking," or "the gate on my fence won't close anymore." Robert would listen carefully, ask a few questions, then walk down one of the narrow aisles and return holding exactly the right part. More than once, customers joked that he knew the town's houses better than the people who lived in them. But perhaps the most important thing about Main Street was not the buildings, it was the people. Nearly everyone who walked along the sidewalks recognized the faces passing by. Teachers from the elementary school waved to shop owners. Teenagers stopped to talk with neighbors who had known them since they were toddlers. Elderly residents sat on benches near the courthouse square, watching the slow movement of the day. In larger cities, people often moved past each other without speaking, but in Millbrook, silence between neighbors felt unusual. A simple greeting, "Morning," or "How are you?" was almost automatic. One late morning, Daniel Turner walked down Main Street during his lunch break from the factory. He passed the diner first. Through the window, he could see Joe Carter wiping the counter while Carol refilled coffee cups. Next, he passed Frank's barber shop. Frank was trimming someone's hair while 2 men sat along the wall debating last night's baseball game. Daniel continued walking until he reached Miller's grocery store. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door rang. Mrs. Miller looked up immediately. "Daniel, you're just in time," she said. "Fresh sandwiches came in from the bakery." Daniel smiled. "Perfect timing, then." He picked up a sandwich and a bottle of soda before bringing them to the counter. Mrs. Miller rung up the purchase and leaned slightly forward. "You hear about the new family moving into the Johnson house?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, I hadn't." "They arrived yesterday afternoon. 2 kids, I think." In a town like Millbrook, news traveled in gentle waves, not through official announcements, but through conversations like this one. By the time Daniel stepped back onto Main Street, at least 5 other people would probably already know about the new family. The sideworks continued filling as the afternoon moved forward. A mail carrier walked slowly along the street, placing letters into metal boxes beside storefront doors. 2 high school students crossed the street carrying milkshakes from the diner. A delivery truck parked beside the bakery while workers unloaded boxes of flour. Every movement felt connected in small, subtle ways. Life on Main Street was not fast, but it was steady. And within that steady rhythm, relationships quietly formed the foundation of the town. People remembered each other's birthdays. They noticed when someone's porch light had been left on all day. They asked about family members who lived in other states. These small gestures might not seem important from the outside, but they created something rare, a place where people rarely felt invisible. In the late afternoon, the sunlight shifted across the storefront windows. The barber shop closed first. Frank turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked slowly towards the diner where he often ate dinner. The grocery store remained open a little longer. Mrs. Miller restocked the shelves while greeting the last few customers of the day. Across the street, Robert Jenkins swept the floor of the hardware store before locking up. Gradually, the noise of the street softened. Cars became less frequent. Footsteps faded. But even as the day slowed, Main Street still held the quiet energy of the town. The diner's neon sign continued glowing in the window. Inside, a few regulars remained seated at the counter, finishing late meals. Outside, streetlights flickered on one by one. For decades, Main Street had remained the heart of Millbrook. Generations had walked those sidewalks. Children had grown into adults who eventually opened their own businesses along the same street. And though the world beyond the town continued to change, new technologies, new cities, new industries, Main Street still carried the feeling of something steady and familiar. It was the kind of place where people remembered each other, where conversations could begin with strangers and end with neighbors, where everyday life...
In the town of Millbrook, there were many people who had lived there for years. Some had grown up in the same houses where they now raised their own children. Others had moved there later in life, drawn by the quiet streets and the slow rhythm of a small American town. But if anyone truly carried the memory of Millbrook inside his mind, it was Harold Whitman. Most people in town simply called him Mr. Whitman, though the older residents still remembered him as Harold, the boy who used to ride his bicycle down Main Street long before the town had traffic lights. Harold was 76 years old, and time had left its gentle marks on him. His hair had turned completely white, and his shoulders leaned slightly forward when he walked. But his eyes were still sharp, and his memory, remarkably, seemed clearer than that of people half his age. If you sat beside Harold long enough, he could tell you stories that stretched back nearly a century. He remembered the town when the roads were still mostly dirt. He remembered when the factory had first opened its doors. He remembered when radios were the center of every living room. And perhaps most importantly, he remembered how America itself had slowly changed across those years. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine. He woke up early, made a simple breakfast of toast and eggs, and then walked slowly down Hawthorne Street toward Main Street. His destination was almost always the same: the Millbrook Diner. The diner had become his unofficial office of memory. He would sit at the same stool near the end of the counter, sip his coffee, and read the morning newspaper. Occasionally, someone younger would sit beside him and ask about something that had happened long ago. Those were the moments Harold enjoyed most. One quiet morning, Daniel Turner found himself sitting next to him. Daniel had come in for breakfast before his shift at the factory. He noticed Harold folding his newspaper carefully and placing it beside his coffee mug. "Morning, Mr. Whitman," Daniel said. Harold nodded politely. "Morning, Daniel." Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I've always wondered something," he said. "What was this town like when you were young?" Harold smiled faintly. "That's a big question," he replied. Daniel laughed. "I guess I've got time." Harold leaned back slightly on the stool and looked out the diner window. For a moment, it seemed as though he wasn't just looking at the street outside, but through it, past the present and into something much older. "Well," he began slowly, "the first thing you'd notice is how quiet it was back then." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Quieter than now?" Harold nodded. "Oh yes, much quieter." He explained that when he was a boy in the late 1940s, Millbrook had been even smaller than it was now. There were fewer cars, fewer shops,
and fewer houses stretching out from the center of town. Most people walked wherever they needed to go, Harold said, or rode bicycles. If someone had a car, everyone in the neighborhood knew it. Daniel smiled. That must have felt strange. Harold chuckled softly. It didn't feel strange at the time. It just felt normal. He described the way the town looked in those early years. The buildings on Main Street were smaller then. Some of the brick storefronts that existed now hadn't been built yet. The grocery store had once been a wooden building with creaky floors. The diner had been half its current size, and the barbershop only had one chair instead of three. But the biggest difference, he said, was the way people followed the news. Daniel glanced at the folded newspaper beside him. What do you mean? Harold tapped the paper gently. Back then, the news felt like something the whole country experienced together. He explained how families gathered around their radios in the evenings. News broadcasts carried voices from distant cities, New York, Chicago, and Washington. People listened carefully to reports about the country and the world. Harold still remembered the day his father had brought home their first radio. I must have been 8 years old. We placed it right in the living room. My parents listened to it every night. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Was that during the war? Harold nodded. Yes, the end of it. Though Harold was young during the final years of World War II, he still remembered the tension that hung in the air during those days. He remembered adults whispering about battles overseas. He remembered neighbors who had sons serving in the military. And he remembered the day the war finally ended. The whole town gathered right here on Main Street. People hugged each other. Some were crying, others were cheering. For a moment, Harold grew quiet. Not everyone came home, he added softly. Daniel nodded respectfully. Harold then spoke about the years that followed. The late 1940s and 50s had brought a sense of optimism to many American towns. Factories expanded, new houses were built, families grew larger. Millbrook had slowly begun to change. That's when the factory outside the town opened, Harold said. Daniel recognized the building immediately. That same one I work at? The very same. Harold explained that when the factory first opened, it felt like the future had arrived. Dozens of new jobs appeared almost overnight. Young men who had grown up in the town suddenly had stable work close to home. Families bought cars, children attended better-funded schools. Main Street became busier. The town started growing. But as the decades passed, the country and the town continued to evolve. Harold described the 1960s as a time when the world seemed to change very quickly. Television became common in American homes. National events reached even small towns like Millbrook through nightly broadcasts. People watched civil rights marches. They watched speeches from Washington. They watched the moon landing. I remember sitting in my living room in 1969 watching those astronauts walk on the moon, Harold said. Daniel laughed. That must have felt unbelievable. It did, Harold replied. For a moment, the whole country felt connected. Harold paused to take another sip of coffee. But change isn't always simple, he continued. He explained that the 1970s and 80s had brought new challenges. Factories across the country began facing economic pressure. Some closed, others reduced their workforce. Millbrook had been fortunate compared to many towns. Its factory survived, though not without difficulty. Some people moved away during those years. Why? Daniel asked. Jobs, Harold replied simply. The town's population had fluctuated. Some storefronts on Main Street closed temporarily, but Millbrook had never completely lost its identity. The reason, Harold believed, was the people. No matter what changed, he said, the town always found a way to stay connected. Daniel thought about the familiar faces he saw every day, the diner owner, the barber, the grocery store clerk. You're right about that, he said. Harold smiled slightly. You see it now, but when you live long enough, you start noticing how slowly everything changes. He explained that history rarely arrives in dramatic moments. Instead, it appears through small shifts over many years. A new highway built nearby, A factory expanding or shrinking, children leaving for college and sometimes returning. Each change seems small when it happens, but after 50 years, the town looks different. Outside the diner window, a few people walked along Main Street. Cars passed slowly. The same quiet rhythm of Millbrook continued forward. Daniel glanced at Harold. "Do you ever miss the way it used to be?" Harold thought about the question carefully. "I miss some things," he admitted, "but not everything." He explained that each generation created its own version of the town. The children playing in the schoolyard today would someday remember a different Millbrook than the one Harold had known, and that was perfectly natural. "Places change," Harold said, "but the memories stay." Daniel finished his breakfast and stood up to leave. Before walking out the door, he turned back toward Harold. "You should write these stories down." Harold chuckled softly. "Oh, I think the town remembers them well enough." Outside, the sun had climbed higher above Main Street. The barbershop door opened as the first customer of the morning stepped inside. Mrs. Miller arranged fruit in the grocery store window. Joe Carter wiped the diner counter once more. Life in Millbrook continued forward just as it always had. But inside the mind of Harold Whitman lived decades of quiet history. Wars, celebrations, struggles, and small victories that had shaped both the town and the country beyond it. To most people walking along the street that morning, he appeared to be just another elderly man enjoying his coffee. But in truth, Harold carried something rare. He carried memory. And through those memories, the past of Millbrook remained alive. He was the old man who remembered everything.
On the northern edge of Millbrook, just beyond the last row of houses and the quiet stretch of farmland, stood a long building made of brick and steel. Its windows reflected the early sunlight each morning, and its tall smokestack rose above the trees like a landmark that could be seen from almost anywhere in town. To an outsider driving past the highway, it might have looked like just another factory, one of thousands scattered across America. But to the people of Millbrook, that building meant far more than machines and metal. It was the place that had built the town. Long before the factory arrived, Millbrook had been little more than a quiet farming community. A handful of families lived along dusty roads, surrounded by cornfields and small orchards. Life moved slowly then, tied closely to the seasons and the unpredictable rhythm of agriculture. In those early days, most families relied on farming for their livelihood. The land provided food, but it rarely brought much wealth. Money came in slowly, and opportunities were limited. Young people often left the town once they were old enough, searching for work in larger cities where factories and businesses promised steadier pay. But everything began to change in the late 1940s. That was when a group of investors from a nearby city chose the open land outside Millbrook as the site for a new manufacturing plant. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible to many residents. A factory in their quiet town? It sounded like something that belonged in larger industrial cities, not among the fields and small houses of Millbrook. Construction began the following spring. For months, trucks rolled into town carrying steel beams, concrete, and heavy machinery. Workers from surrounding counties arrived to help build the massive structure. The sound of hammering and welding echoed across the open land. Children rode their bicycles out to the construction site after school just to watch the building rise piece by piece. Older residents stood at a distance, curious about what this new chapter might bring. By the time the factory was completed, it stretched nearly the length of 2 football fields. Its brick walls were fresh and bright, its windows clean and shining. Inside, dozens of machines waited to begin their work. When the factory officially opened its doors, something remarkable happened. Jobs appeared almost overnight. The company announced that it would manufacture industrial machine parts, small metal components used in equipment all across the country. At first, the factory hired 50 workers. Within 2 years, that number doubled.
Soon, nearly every family in Millbrook had someone connected to the factory in some way. Fathers worked on the assembly lines. Brothers operated heavy machines. Uncles drove delivery trucks carrying finished products to distant cities. The factory quickly became the economic heart of the town. Every morning before sunrise, the parking lot filled with pickup trucks and sedans as workers arrived for their shifts. The sound of the factory whistle echoed across the town, signaling the beginning of another workday. Inside the building, the machines hummed constantly. Metal sheets were cut, shaped, and polished. Workers in blue uniforms moved carefully between stations, checking measurements and tightening bolts. The work was not glamorous, but it was steady, and steady work meant stability. For many families, the factory represented something larger than a paycheck. It represented the promise of the American working-class dream, the belief that hard work and determination could build a better life. With stable income, families began buying homes. New houses appeared along streets that had once been empty fields. Children attended better schools. Local businesses along Main Street began to grow as workers spent their earnings in town. The grocery store expanded its shelves. The diner added new booths. The hardware store doubled its inventory. Millbrook was no longer just a quiet farming town. It was becoming something new, a community built around industry. Among the first workers hired at the factory was a young man named Robert Whitman. Robert had grown up in Millbrook during the years when farming dominated the town's economy. Like many young men of his generation, he had once expected to leave in search of better opportunities, but when the factory opened, he saw a different future. Robert joined the factory during its first year of operation. He started as a machine operator, learning how to handle the heavy equipment that shaped metal into precise components. The work required patience and attention to detail. Mistakes could slow production or damage expensive machinery. But Robert was careful and hard-working. Within a few years, he became one of the most reliable workers on the factory floor. His story was similar to many others in Millbrook. The factory did not make people rich, but it offered something equally valuable: stability. Workers knew that if they showed up each day, did their jobs well, and supported one another, they could build a life that felt secure. Paychecks arrived regularly. Families planned their futures with confidence. Vacations, once rare luxuries, became possible. New cars appeared in driveways. For the children growing up in Millbrook during those decades, the factory seemed almost permanent. It stood there day and night, its windows glowing with light during evening shifts, its machines humming steadily. To them, it felt like a pillar of the town, something that would always exist, and for a long time it did. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the factory expanded its operations. Additional wings were added to the building. More machines were installed. New workers were hired each year. Millbrook's population slowly increased as families moved into the area seeking employment. Main Street grew busier. The diner became crowded during lunch breaks as factory workers filled its booths. The barber shop stayed open later to accommodate evening shifts. The town's identity became closely tied to the factory. People introduced themselves not just by their names, but by their roles inside the plant. I work on the stamping line. I handle quality inspection. I drive the delivery trucks. These jobs formed the backbone of everyday life. But beyond the routines of work and paychecks, the factory also shaped the culture of the town. Workers developed strong bonds with one another. They shared long shifts, difficult tasks, and moments of pride when production goals were met. On Friday evenings, groups of coworkers often gathered at the diner or local bar to relax after the week's labor. Conversations revolved around machines, schedules, and small victories on the factory floor. The sense of shared purpose was strong. Everyone understood that the success of the factory meant the success of the town. Even the children felt connected to it. School field trips sometimes included visits to the factory, where students watched the machines operate behind safety barriers. Teachers explained how the parts produced there were used in equipment across the country. It made the children feel as though their small town played a role in something much larger. And in many ways, it did. The products manufactured in Millbrook traveled hundreds of miles to factories, construction sites, and businesses across America. Though the town itself remained small, its work reached far beyond its borders. For decades, this system continued. Generations followed similar paths. Fathers who had worked at the factory saw their sons eventually join the same workforce. Families built traditions around the rhythms of factory life: morning shifts, evening shifts, the whistle marking the start and end of each workday. But time, as it always does, slowly introduced change. By the late 1920s, the manufacturing world across America began shifting. New technologies appeared. Automation replaced certain manual tasks. Global competition increased pressure on companies to reduce costs. Some factories in other towns closed entirely. Others downsized their operations. Millbrook's factory felt these pressures too. Production slowed during certain years. Some workers accepted early retirement. Hiring became less frequent. Yet, despite these challenges, the factory remained standing. It continued providing jobs for many families, even if the workforce was smaller than it had once been. The building itself aged gracefully. Its brick walls weathered decades of wind and rain. Its machines, though updated and repaired over time, still echoed with the same mechanical rhythm that had once symbolized progress. For residents of Millbrook, the factory remained more than a workplace. It was a symbol of the town's past and its identity. It represented the generations who had built their lives through steady labor, the fathers who had woken before sunrise, the mothers who had balanced family life with factory schedules, the children who had grown up hearing stories about the machines that shaped metal into something useful. Even today, when people in Millbrook speak about the history of their town, they often begin with the same phrase, "back when the factory first opened," because that moment marked the beginning of a transformation. A quiet farming community had become an industrial town. A group of hopeful workers had built stable lives through dedication and skill. And the American working-class dream, simple, steady, and deeply rooted in hard work, had taken shape inside a brick building on the edge of Millbrook. For outsiders passing along the highway, it might still look like just another factory. But for the people of Millbrook, it will always be remembered as something far greater. It was the factory that built the town.
In Millbrook, evenings arrived slowly, almost gently, like the town itself was taking a deep breath after a long day. The afternoon sunlight would begin to soften, turning the bright streets into long stretches of warm gold. Shadows from trees stretched across sidewalks, and the distant hum of the factory slowly faded as workers finished their shifts and began heading home. For most people in Millbrook, the evening was not a time for hurry. It was the part of the day when life slowed down enough for people to notice the small things. The quiet breeze moving through the trees, the sound of children laughing somewhere down the street, the familiar creak of a wooden porch chair. It was the hour when front porches became small gathering places, and porch lights glowed softly above front doors. On Hawthorne Street, the Turner family had just finished dinner. Inside the kitchen, the last plates had been washed, and the smell of roasted chicken still lingered faintly in the air. Sarah Turner wiped her hands on a towel and glanced through the window toward the fading sunlight. "Looks like a nice evening," she said. Her husband Daniel nodded while folding the evening newspaper. "Feels cooler than yesterday," he replied. Their two children, 12-year-old Jacob and 8-year-old Emily, were already waiting near the front door. "Can we go outside now?" Jacob asked. Daniel smiled. "You already know the answer." The children rushed out the door, their footsteps echoing down the wooden porch steps before disappearing onto the sidewalk. Evenings in Millbrook belonged to the children almost as much as they belonged to the adults. Within minutes, bicycles began rolling along the street. A basketball bounced somewhere nearby. Two boys kicked a soccer ball between them while shouting playful arguments about imaginary teams and impossible goals.
the street slowly filled with the cheerful chaos of childhood. Emily joined a group of girls drawing colorful patterns on the sidewalk with chalk. Their artwork spread across the concrete like small temporary murals, flowers, stars, and houses with smiling windows. Jacob and his friends raced their bicycles from one end of the street to the other. The laughter of children traveled easily through the warm evening air. Meanwhile, the adults settled onto their porches. Daniel and Sarah put 2 wooden chairs near the porch railing. Daniel leaned back while Sarah held a glass of iced tea. Across the street, Mrs. Langford was already sitting on her porch swing. She waved gently. "Evening," she called. "Evening," Sarah replied. Mrs. Langford had lived on Hawthorne Street for nearly 30 years. She had watched many families move in and out of the neighborhood, but the rhythm of evenings had remained mostly the same. Porches, she often said, were where the real conversations happened. Throughout Millbrook, similar scenes unfolded. Front doors opened, porch lights flickered on, neighbors stepped outside to enjoy the quiet hours before nightfall. Some houses had rocking chairs, others had small benches or porch swings, but nearly every home had a place where someone could sit and watch the street slowly settle into evening. A few blocks away, Harold Whitman sat on his own porch with a small cup of coffee. At 76, Harold no longer moved as quickly as he once had, but he still enjoyed observing the gentle rhythm of the neighborhood. From his porch, he could see children playing, parents talking, and dogs wandering lazily beside their owners. This scene reminded him of evenings from decades earlier. Back then, life followed a very similar pattern. After dinner, families would gather outside, radios sometimes played softly from open windows. Fireflies flickered across yards while children chased them with glass jars. Some things in Millbrook had changed over the years, but evenings under the porch light had remained remarkably familiar. Down the street, 2 men stood near a pickup truck discussing work at the factory. "Machine number 4 broke down again today," one of them said. The other shook his head. "That thing's older than both of us." They laughed. Factory conversations often followed workers home. Long shifts created shared experiences, and evenings provided the first chance to talk about them in a relaxed way. Not every conversation focused on work, though. Some neighbors discussed upcoming town events. Others talked about their children's school projects. Sometimes people simply sat quietly, enjoying the calm of the fading day. As the sky turned deeper shades of orange and pink, the street lights slowly flickered on. One by one, porch lights joined them. Small glowing circles appeared above doorways all along the street. For children, the moment when porch lights turned on carried a special meaning. It was a silent signal that the evening was beginning to end. Parents often used porch lights as gentle reminders. When the lights come on, it's almost time to come inside. But until that moment arrived, the street remained alive with movement. Jacob and his friends organized a small baseball game using a plastic bat and a tennis ball. The rules changed every few minutes depending on who was winning. Emily continued decorating the sidewalk with chalk drawings. Their artwork spread across the concrete like small temporary murals, flowers, stars, and houses with smiling windows. Jacob and his friends raced their bicycles from one end of the street to the other. The laughter of children traveled easily through the warm evening air. Meanwhile, the adults settled onto their porches. Daniel and Sarah put 2 wooden chairs near the porch railing. Daniel leaned back while Sarah held a glass of iced tea. Across the street, Mrs. Langford was already sitting on her porch swing. She waved gently. "Evening," she called. "Evening," Sarah replied. Mrs. Langford had lived on Hawthorne Street for nearly 30 years. She had watched many families move in and out of the neighborhood, but the rhythm of evenings had remained mostly the same. Porches, she often said, were where the real conversations happened. Throughout Millbrook, similar scenes unfolded. Front doors opened, porch lights flickered on, neighbors stepped outside to enjoy the quiet hours before nightfall. Some houses had rocking chairs, others had small benches or porch swings, but nearly every home had a place where someone could sit and watch the street slowly settle into evening. A few blocks away, Harold Whitman sat on his own porch with a small cup of coffee. At 76, Harold no longer moved as quickly as he once had, but he still enjoyed observing the gentle rhythm of the neighborhood. From his porch, he could see children playing, parents talking, and dogs wandering lazily beside their owners. This scene reminded him of evenings from decades earlier. Back then, life followed a very similar pattern. After dinner, families would gather outside, radios sometimes played softly from open windows. Fireflies flickered across yards while children chased them with glass jars. Some things in Millbrook had changed over the years, but evenings under the porch light had remained remarkably familiar. Down the street, two men stood near a pickup truck discussing work at the factory. "Machine number 4 broke down again today," one of them said. The other shook his head. "That thing's older than both of us." They laughed. Factory conversations often followed workers home. Long shifts created shared experiences, and evenings provided the first chance to talk about them in a relaxed way. Not every conversation focused on work, though. Some neighbors discussed upcoming town events. Others talked about their children's school projects. Sometimes people simply sat quietly, enjoying the calm of the fading day. As the sky turned deeper shades of orange and pink, the street lights slowly flickered on. One by one, porch lights joined them. Small glowing circles appeared above doorways all along the street. For children, the moment when porch lights turned on carried a special meaning. It was a silent signal that the evening was beginning to end. Parents often used porch lights as gentle reminders. When the lights come on, it's almost time to come inside. But until that moment arrived, the street remained alive with movement. Jacob and his friends organized a small baseball game using a plastic bat and a tennis ball. The rules changed every few minutes depending on who was winning. Emily continued decorating the sidewalk with chalk drawings. Their artwork spread across the concrete like small temporary murals, flowers, stars, and houses with smiling windows. Jacob and his friends raced their bicycles from one end of the street to the other. The laughter of children traveled easily through the warm evening air. Meanwhile, the adults settled onto their porches. Daniel and Sarah put 2 wooden chairs near the porch railing. Daniel leaned back while Sarah held a glass of iced tea. Across the street, Mrs. Langford was already sitting on her porch swing. She waved gently. "Evening," she called. "Evening," Sarah replied. Mrs. Langford had lived on Hawthorne Street for nearly 30 years. She had watched many families move in and out of the neighborhood, but the rhythm of evenings had remained mostly the same. Porches, she often said, were where the real conversations happened. Throughout Millbrook, similar scenes unfolded. Front doors opened, porch lights flickered on, neighbors stepped outside to enjoy the quiet hours before nightfall. Some houses had rocking chairs, others had small benches or porch swings, but nearly every home had a place where someone could sit and watch the street slowly settle into evening. A few blocks away, Harold Whitman sat on his own porch with a small cup of coffee. At 76, Harold no longer moved in Millbrook. Most days began and ended quietly. The town had its own rhythm, steady, predictable, and comfortable. Mornings were filled with coffee and newspapers. Afternoons passed with the sound of work and school bells. Evenings slowed into conversations on porches and the laughter of children playing in the streets. It was the kind of place where big events rarely happened. Or at least, that was how it usually felt. But sometimes, history did not arrive with warning. Sometimes it traveled silently through wires and airwaves, carried by voices on the radio or images flickering across television screens. And when it did, even a quiet town like Millbrook could feel the weight of a moment that belonged to the entire nation. One such morning began like any other. The sun rose over the trees on the eastern side of town. The familiar smell of coffee drifted through kitchens as families prepared for another ordinary day. Daniel Turner woke before 6 and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. The front page carried several stories about politics and the economy, but nothing that seemed particularly unusual. Sarah Turner packed lunches for the children, while Emily searched for her school backpack. "Did you finish your homework?" Sarah asked. Emily nodded confidently. "I did it after dinner." Jacob was already outside, checking the air and the tires of his bicycle before school. The morning moved along with the quiet efficiency of routine. By 7 o'clock, Main Street had begun to wake up. The Millbrook Diner filled with the usual group of early customers. Joe Carter stood behind the counter cooking eggs and pancakes while a small radio played softly on a shelf near the coffee machine. The radio was usually tuned to music in the mornings, but on that particular day, the music suddenly stopped. A brief pause filled the air before a serious voice replaced it. "This is a special news bulletin." At first, most people inside the diner barely noticed. Harold Whitman was reading his newspaper. 2 construction workers were discussing a roofing project. Carol, the waitress, carried a tray of coffee cups between tables, but Joe Carter turned the volume slightly higher. The voice on the radio continued. "We interrupt our regular programming to bring you an important national update." Gradually, conversations began to fade. Something in the announcer's tone felt different. People looked up from their plates. Harold folded his newspaper slowly and listened. The report described a major national event unfolding hundreds of miles away. Details were still unclear, but it was obvious that something significant had happened, something that would soon dominate every newspaper headline and television broadcast across the country. The announcer spoke carefully, repeating key facts as they became available. Inside the diner, silence replaced the usual morning chatter. Even the clatter of dishes seemed quieter. Harold leaned slightly forward on his stool. "I've heard that tone before," he said softly. Joe glanced toward him. "What do you mean?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He simply continued listening. Across town, similar moments were unfolding. At the elementary school, teachers had just begun their morning lessons when the principal stepped quietly into several classrooms. He spoke with the teachers in low voices before turning on the televisions mounted near the front of the rooms. The screens flickered to life, showing a news broadcast. Students watched with curiosity as reporters spoke quickly and images from distant cities appeared on the screen. Most of the children didn't fully understand what they were seeing, but the serious expressions on the adults' faces told them that something unusual was happening. At the factory outside town, machines hummed steadily as workers moved along the assembly line. Daniel Turner had just begun checking a series of measurements on metal components when someone called out across the floor, "Hey, come look at this." A small television sat in the corner of the break room. Several workers had already gathered around it. Daniel walked over and saw the same broadcast that had interrupted the diner's radio earlier that morning. The news anchor spoke quickly, while footage from the event played repeatedly. The room remained quiet as workers tried to understand what they were witnessing. Factories were places of constant noise, machines running, tools clanking, workers calling instructions to one another. But in that moment, the break room felt strangely still. Back on Main Street, the grocery store television had also been turned on. Mrs. Miller stood behind the counter with her hands resting on the edge of the register. 2 customers stood nearby watching the screen. The report was now repeating details from earlier broadcasts. Though the event had happened far away, it felt suddenly very close. People began arriving in small groups to watch the coverage together. Some stood silently. Others asked quiet questions. Is this really happening? Do they know what caused it? No, not yet. Across Millbrook, radios and televisions became the center of attention. The barber shop turned on its television as well. Frank Delaney paused mid-haircut as the broadcast filled the room. The customer in his chair stared at the mirror, watching the reflection of the screen behind him. "I never thought I'd see something like this," he murmured. Harold shook his head slowly. "Neither did I." By midday, the entire town seemed to be following the news. Cars moved more slowly along Main Street as drivers glanced toward store windows where televisions were visible. Inside the diner, the usual lunchtime crowd gathered around the radio. Joe Carter kept the volume high enough for everyone to hear. Harold Whitman sat quietly at the counter. He had lived long enough to recognize moments like this. Moments when the country seemed to pause all at once. Moments when ordinary routines seemed less important. Daniel arrived from the factory during his lunch break. He stepped inside the diner and immediately noticed the unusual silence. Everyone was listening. Joe nodded toward the radio. "You heard about it?" Daniel nodded. "They've had the TV on the factory all morning." He sat down beside Harold. Neither man spoke for a while. The announcer's voice continued describing the developing situation. More details had emerged now, though many questions remained unanswered. Harold finally broke the silence. "I remember a day like this," he quietly said. Daniel glanced toward him. "When?" "Years ago," Harold replied, "when another big moment reached this town through the radio." He explained that during his childhood, people had gathered around radios in a very similar way when national news arrived. The technology had changed, radios, televisions, now even faster communication, but the feeling remained the same, a sense that something larger than the town was unfolding, and that everyone, no matter how distant they were, had suddenly become part of it. Throughout the afternoon, people in Millbrook continued chatting for updates. The library placed a television near the front desk so visitors could watch. Teachers at the school allowed students to see the broadcasts between lessons. Even the factory slowed its pace slightly as workers paused to hear the latest reports. The town's usual rhythm had been interrupted, not by anything happening directly within its streets, but by an event far beyond its borders. Yet the emotional impact traveled quickly. By evening, the streets of Millbrook felt quieter than usual. Families gathered in their living rooms watching television together. The glow of screens flickered through windows across the neighborhood. At the Turner house, Daniel and Sarah sat with their children on the couch. The broadcast replayed footage from earlier in the day while reporters discussed what might happen next. Jacob asked a question softly. "Why did this happen?" Daniel hesitated. "That's something people are still trying to understand." Emily leaned closer to her mother. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah placed a reassuring arm around her. "Many people are working to help," she said. Outside, the town remained calm. The same streets, the same houses, but the atmosphere felt different. Even in small towns, moments of national significance could ripple outward like waves. They reached kitchens and classrooms, factories and diners, porches and living rooms. Late that evening, Harold Whitman stepped onto his porch. The sky above Millbrook was dark now, filled with quiet stars. He listened to the distant sounds of televisions still playing in nearby homes. The news continued broadcasting.
In Millbrook, the passage of time could often feel slow and almost invisible. The same streets welcomed the same routines year after year.
The diner opened at dawn, the grocery store arranged its shelves, and the factory whistle echoed across town like a familiar clock marking the hours of the day. For the older residents, the town represented stability. It was a place where people grew up, found work, raised families, and slowly watched the seasons pass. But for the younger generation, something had begun to change. It was not a sudden change, nor was it something that could be easily pointed to. Instead, it appeared gradually in the thoughts and conversations of the town's teenagers and young adults. They were growing up in the same town as their parents, but they were seeing the world in very different ways. One afternoon at Millbrook High School, the final bell rang loudly through the hallways. Lockers slammed shut, and students poured into the corridors, eager to leave after a long day of classes. Among them was 17-year-old Jacob Turner. Jacob had grown up hearing stories about Millbrook's past, stories about when the factory first opened, when Main Street had fewer stores, and when nearly everyone expected to spend their entire lives within the same few miles. His father, Daniel, often spoke about the stability that the factory had brought to the town. It gave people a future, Daniel would say. And in many ways, that was true. But Jacob and many of his friends were growing up during a time when the world felt larger and more complicated than it had for previous generations. Technology had changed the way they learned about the world. Television brought images from distant countries into their living rooms. Music from different cultures traveled through radios and cassette players. Books and magazines described cities filled with opportunities that seemed far beyond the quiet streets of Millbrook. After school, Jacob met his friends near the basketball court behind the gymnasium. Mark Simmons leaned against the fence as he adjusted the straps of his backpack. "You guys ever think about leaving this place?" Mark asked suddenly. Jacob shrugged. "Sometimes." Their friend Lisa Ramirez sat on the wooden bench nearby, flipping through a college brochure she had picked up from the guidance office. "My cousin lives in Chicago," she said. "She says there are thousands of people on the streets all the time. Restaurants, music, museums, everything." Mark laughed. "Sounds busy." "It sounds exciting," Lisa replied. For the students of Millbrook High, conversations like this had become common. They respected the town they had grown up in, but many of them were beginning to imagine lives beyond its familiar boundaries. At home that evening, Jacob sat at the kitchen table working on a history assignment. The topic was economic changes in American towns during the 20th century. His father, Daniel, walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Still studying?" Daniel asked. Jacob nodded. "It's about how towns changed after factories started closing in some places." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down. "That's not the happiest topic." Jacob looked up. "Did you ever think about leaving Millbrook when you were my age?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Not really," he said. "Why not?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Because most people didn't think that way back then." He explained that when he was young, many teenagers expected to follow paths similar to their parents. The factory offered reliable jobs, homes were affordable, the town felt stable and predictable. For many people, that was enough. "We didn't feel like we were missing anything," Daniel said. Jacob considered this quietly. "But what if there's more out there?" he asked. Daniel smiled gently. "There probably is." Across town, similar conversations were happening in other households. Parents who had built their lives around the rhythms of Millbrook were beginning to notice that their children were imagining different futures. Some teenagers dreamed of attending universities in large cities. Others talked about careers in technology, art, or science, fields that did not exist in the small economy of Millbrook. After school, Jacob met his friends near the basketball court behind the gymnasium. Mark Simmons leaned against the fence as he adjusted the straps of his backpack. You guys ever think about leaving this place? Mark asked suddenly. Jacob shrugged. Sometimes. Their friend Lisa Ramirez sat on the wooden bench nearby, flipping through a college brochure she had picked up from the guidance office. My cousin lives in Chicago, she said. She says there are thousands of people on the streets all the time. Restaurants, music, museums, everything. Mark laughed. Sounds busy. It sounds exciting, Lisa replied. For the students of Millbrook High, conversations like this had become common. They respected the town they had grown up in, but many of them were beginning to imagine lives beyond its familiar boundaries. At home that evening, Jacob sat at the kitchen table working on a history assignment. The topic was economic changes in American towns during the 20th century. His father, Daniel, walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. Still studying? Daniel asked. Jacob nodded. It's about how towns changed after factories started closing in some places. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down. That's not the happiest topic. Jacob looked up. Did you ever think about leaving Millbrook when you were my age? Daniel thought for a moment before answering. Not really, he said. Why not? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Because most people didn't think that way back then. He explained that when he was young, many teenagers expected to follow paths similar to their parents. The factory offered reliable jobs, homes were affordable, the town felt stable and predictable. For many people, that was enough. We didn't feel like we were missing anything, Daniel said. Jacob considered this quietly. But what if there's more out there, he asked. Daniel smiled gently. There probably is. Across town, similar conversations were happening in other households. Parents who had built their lives around the rhythms of Millbrook were beginning to notice that their children were imagining different futures. Some teenagers dreamed of attending universities in large cities. Others talked about careers in technology, art, or science, fields that did not exist in the small economy of Millbrook. After school, Jacob met his friends near the basketball court behind the gymnasium. Mark Simmons leaned against the fence as he adjusted the straps of his backpack. You guys ever think about leaving this place? Mark asked suddenly. Jacob shrugged. Sometimes. Their friend Lisa Ramirez sat on the wooden bench nearby, flipping through a college brochure she had picked up from the guidance office. My cousin lives in Chicago, she said. She says there are thousands of people on the streets all the time. Restaurants, music, museums, everything. Mark laughed. Sounds busy. It sounds exciting, Lisa replied. For the students of Millbrook High, conversations like this had become common. They respected the town they had grown up in, but many of them were beginning to imagine lives beyond its familiar boundaries. At home that evening, Jacob sat at the kitchen table working on a history assignment. The topic was economic changes in American towns during the 20th century. His father, Daniel, walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. Still studying? Daniel asked. Jacob nodded. It's about how towns changed after factories started closing in some places. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down. That's not the happiest topic. Jacob looked up. Did you ever think about leaving Millbrook when you were my age? Daniel thought for a moment before answering. Not really, he said. Why not? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Because most people didn't think that way back then. He explained that when he was young, many teenagers expected to follow paths similar to their parents. The factory offered reliable jobs, homes were affordable, the town felt stable and predictable. For many people, that was enough. We didn't feel like we were missing anything, Daniel said. Jacob considered this quietly. But what if there's more out there, he asked. Daniel smiled gently. There probably is. Across town, similar conversations were happening in other households. Parents who had built their lives around the rhythms of Millbrook were beginning to notice that their children were imagining different futures. Some teenagers dreamed of attending universities in large cities. Others talked about careers in technology, art, or science, fields that did not exist in the small economy of Millbrook. After school, Jacob met his friends near the basketball court behind the gymnasium. Mark Simmons leaned against the fence as he adjusted the straps of his backpack. "You guys ever think about leaving this place?" Mark asked suddenly. Jacob shrugged. "Sometimes." Their friend Lisa Ramirez sat on the wooden bench nearby, flipping through a college brochure she had picked up from the guidance office. "My cousin lives in Chicago," she said. "She says there are thousands of people on the streets all the time. Restaurants, music, museums, everything."